Thank you. So this project studies public health in Hong Kong in the 1950s and 70s and considers how public health campaigns reflected and affected ideas of nationalism, colonialism, and nation building in the late colonial period. So as a bit of background, colonial rule in Hong Kong from the mid-19th century to World War II can generally be described as negligent. The British, seeing Hong Kong primarily as a trade port, made little investments in city infrastructure, instead opting to keep clean British spaces away from dirty Chinese spaces. But separation was not always possible. Overcrowding and international trade exacerbated the spread of infectious diseases, most disastrously with the 1894 plague. In response, the government imposed strict quarantine policies. However, Chinese citizens largely protested such inspections, setting up barricades and throwing stones at health inspectors. Many feared that health inspections were a front for more sinister designs on their women and children. In turn, the British labeled the Chinese citizens as being hopelessly uneducated and uncivilized. In sum, these interventions were an intimacy desired by none, a relationship characterized by distrust and resistance. In the post-war era, public health in Hong Kong was especially grim. Many medical sites were destroyed or repurposed in the war, and many public health officials retreated to Britain. Yet, this period was also marked by the beginning of large, citywide public health campaigns, including the Miss Ping An competition and the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign. The Miss Ping An competition was a health inspection and health education and inspection campaign undertaken in the 1950s that focused on preventing disease through health education. 10 years later, the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign was a public health campaign centered on hygiene as a symbol of civic responsibility and modernity. The character of these campaigns contrasts with the colonial administration's history of negligent, aggressively paternalistic public health policy and the city's respondent history of protest and resistance. Through a case study of these two campaigns, my project argues that the development and reception of public health campaigns in the post-war period resulted from parallel developments in Hong Kong's colonial and national identity. Specifically, the new importance of Hong Kong to the British colonial and American Cold War interests incentivized public health and welfare investments. Growing prosperity also facilitated the emergence of a new Hong Kong identity, encouraging Hong Kong citizens to adopt hygienic practices as a means of self-strengthening and distinction. In turn, the relative success of these public health campaigns reinforced nationalist and colonial commitments to the city. So first, I will talk a little bit about the Miss Ping An competition. In 1959, the Urban Council launched a new system of blockhouse inspections under the name of the Miss Ping An competition. Ping An means like well-being in Chinese. These inspections targeted resettlement areas, which were areas of public housing designed primarily for Chinese immigrants. In 1959, 6 resettlement homes were automatically enrolled in the competition. For 2 months, area officers made bi-weekly visits to each home and scored houses based on their cleanliness. The cleanest estates won about $300 Hong Kong dollars each, about $530 US today, and the title of Miss Ping An of the estate. By 1961, this competition expanded to cover 11 resettlement areas to crown a total of 191 winners out of 60,000 participants. The Miss Ping An competition reveals important differences in public health approaches. First, the campaign took on a prevention-oriented approach to public health. Before, health inspections were responding to outbreaks, but this inspection targeted areas of high risk, namely overcrowded, poorly ventilated resettlement homes. The prevention-focused approach was reflected in the new organization of the Urban Council. Urban areas were divided into health areas and then subdivided into health districts and units. This allowed for a more systematic approach to health inspection. Also unique to the campaign was how the administration tried to incorporate women into the public health movement. From the feminized personification of well-being in the Miss Ping An mascot to the exclusive focus on housewives in the competition, this campaign solicited the support of women as agents of change, which contrasts the perception of Chinese women as hopelessly uneducated hindrances as expressed by colonial administrators and doctors of the early 20th century. On some level, the campaign was also more invasive than campaigns of the early 20th century. Now, the government called for regular inspections of households regardless of infectious risk. In order for this to kind of be accepted by the to facilitate cooperation, the government took on a more soft paternalistic approach. So, instead of negative reinforcement whereby dirty or contaminated items were thrown out by the sanitary board's discretion, people were awarded with financial and social incentives. Greater care was also placed on communication. So under the 1901 ordinance, people could come in without notice between the hours of 5 a.m. and 6 p.m. However, because this was a more preventative campaign, residents could be notified in advance of their inspection times. As observed by the administration, access to the premises thus proved easier. Adopting a more preventative approach that sought to bring women into the public health effort, the campaign was incentive-based, more systematically conducted, and more considerate of its citizens. This is not to say that the colonial administration's paternalistic approach to public health had disappeared. Rather, it had been altered in the wake of a new post-war status quo to allow for effective governance within new constraints and desires. These changes to public health in the 1950s were generally shaped by its local and international contexts, which I will kind of elaborate on briefly. So first of all, at the basic level, there was a strong necessity for change. As I alluded to earlier, there was a major public health infrastructure collapse, and on a practical level, rates of infectious diseases remained very high in the colony. The prevalence of communicable diseases was very important to the government because these were the health conditions that represented the greatest threat to the government's labor productivity. This was exacerbated by an overpopulation and immigration challenge. World War II, Civil War, and the subsequent turn of China to communist state created political and social instability in China, leading to major waves of immigration to Hong Kong. After a deadly fire in migrant squatter homes, the Hong Kong government developed a revised resettlement program to build high-rise residential structures for refugees and low-income families. However, resentful for these unexpected costs, the government saw health education campaigns as a cost-effective way to reduce public health risks while not spending too much money on developing greater sanitation efforts. Additionally, as a result of this overcrowding and immigration, scholars talk about what is created of a refugee mentality. So immigrants in the early post-war decades saw Hong Kong as a lifeboat compared to the turbulence of China, and therefore were more willing to accept the paternalistic policies in Hong Kong compared to local Hong Kong residents. This is coupled by the fact that they were living in government-provided public housing forms, so they were less likely to kind of resist invasive sanitation practices. Additionally, as a perhaps surprising factor was these economic developments. So even though Hong Kong emerged from post-World War II greatly scathed, capital did flow from China to Hong Kong due to China's closed-door policy after 1949, which transformed Hong Kong from a trade port to an industrial and manufacturing economy. As Hong Kong became increasingly self-sufficient and even valuable to colonial funds, greater attention was paid on the health of the labor force. And these are exacerbated by broader international developments. So the first one would be changes to colonialism. The old colonial system of laissez-faire or draconian rule was kind of perceived as backwards by the new liberal international order as led by the United States. Previous policies of negligence or violence, such as forceful home sanitation squadrons, called into question Britain's presence in Hong Kong. But social and economic growth in Hong Kong allowed Britain to tell a new narrative of colonial beneficence, wherein Britain transformed a barren rock into a prosperous city. As such, investments in health education, which had been attempted with half-hearted measures in the early 20th century, took on renewed engagement and optimism. This also helps to explain why, in this period of decolonization that we see in India and Pakistan, Hong Kong continued to be a crown jewel for the British colony. Additionally, this was mitigated by Cold War considerations. The possibility of Hong Kong falling to communism threatened American strategic ambitions in Asia. Indeed, in 1957, a secret agreement between America and Britain was struck, where the United States agreed to consider Hong Kong a joint defense problem. Although the United States put pressure on Britain to decolonize, it was willing to overlook Hong Kong to maintain an important outpost in Asia. Cold War considerations also prompted more long-term planning for Hong Kong. If Hong Kong were to be a capitalist outpost in Asia, it had to be a shining city on a hill, a modern and a clean city. Additionally, on a local level, there were also civic developments and civic engagement. So Dr. Pak-Fu Wu, who campaigned on hiring welfare workers to provide public health education for those in resettlement homes, is a good example of one. Winning his election in 1956, Dr. Wu became the chairman of the Health Education Committee of the Urban Council, and his vision largely shaped the direction of health education in resettlement areas. The 1950s also saw the increased participation of Chinese citizens in political life. From 1950 to 1958, the proportion of senior Chinese officials in public service increased from 10% to about 35%. This period also saw a more pronounced role of women in public life. Women were increasingly found in public offices, especially in medical and health departments. These developments encouraged a public health strategy that incorporated women into the health-making process. And so in terms of the impact of the Miss Ping An competition, it's kind of difficult to discuss the qualitative impacts of a public health campaign. But we can see that the perceived efficacy of Miss Ping An shaped colonial and national attitudes in Hong Kong. Cooperation between the government and citizens on matters of public health was, for the administration, an encouraging indicator that Hong Kong could be reformed. Similarly, the collective action of residents cultivated a sense of civic pride. As Hong Kong's public health and welfare system outpaced China's, the perception of Hong Kong citizens as in some way exemplary fed into the formation of Hong Kong identity as distinct from the mainland. And this brings us to the 1970s and the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign. So in 1972, the government launched the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign, a public health campaign focused on outdoor sanitation. If the Miss Ping An competition was large in scope for about 60,000 residents, this was a public health campaign of an unprecedented scale. It was distinctive for its use of very high-profile engagement events, such as this one where a 30-foot-tall paper mache of a monster was blown up, and then its debris was cleaned up by Miss Super Cleans, a cohort of miniskirt-wearing, broom-wielding women. The Urban Council, in conjunction with public and private organizations, sponsored a variety of competitions, including my favorite one of all, a bride cleaning campaign, and a bride cleaning photography contest, which was co-sponsored by a bridal business. In all, the campaign spent about $1.25 million Hong Kong dollars on publicity, which represented about a third of all campaign costs. I think the importance of publicity is especially reflected in the different gendered constructions across the Miss Ping An, the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign. So if you recall, the Miss Ping An competition was really centered on the health literacy of housewives. But now, Miss Ping An was replaced by Miss Super Clean, a title for campaign representatives in purple and orange patterned miniskirts. These dainty women, many of whom worked in the beauty industry, had no experience in public health, were the public face of the campaign and reflects the campaign's focus on publicity over education. Although the campaign's investment in publicity reflects a willingness from the administration to invest in their public health resources, it's also worth noting where this campaign sought to mitigate costs. Spending on promotion was almost that double of spending for staff, equipment, and transport facilities combined. As such, the campaign relied on a large volunteer base, largely of women and children. This call to action notably absolves the government from reforms in matters of waste collection and management, which were badly needed at the time. Thus, the focus on a public-facing campaign came at the cost of more material government investments. While exorbitant in display, this campaign can also be understood within the context of neoliberal cost-containing efforts. Especially unique to the campaign was its rhetorical framing. If you recall, the Miss Ping An competition really emphasized the importance of health consciousness in improving public health, but that rhetoric is really not present in this campaign. The public messaging for this campaign centered on one's civic responsibility. Chinese newspapers called on citizens to protect their cities, using slogans such as, to be a virtuous citizen, one has to lead by example. So people said, this is Hong Kong, which means fragrant harbor in Chinese, not smelly harbor, the opposite translation. Health literacy was not the central hindrance of poor public health. Instead, litterers were described as lazy. My favorite one is Emilia Sin, who's age 13, writing a newspaper, who described the central problem of Hong Kong as selfishness. In tandem with the campaign's intensive messaging, the government also intensified public surveillance. The Urban Services Department hired anti-littering squads who monitored the streets and fined about 20,000 people within a year for littering. Across the 1970s and 80s, punishments became progressively stricter for littering, up to 1,000 Hong Kong dollars for a first offense. In accordance, propaganda posters took on an increasingly aggressive tone, as seen by the Hong Kong is looking poster, where you have these feminized eyes looking aggressively at a child who's picking up cleaning. Ultimately, hidden between the glamour and pomp was an ever-present desire for colonial control, adopted for the new liberal international order. So public health and sanitation efforts would have likely increased over this period, given improved economic conditions. But local and international political context fueled an almost frenzied public health campaign to alter how Hong Kong citizens interacted with the public space. So the first major factor is the rise of affluence. Hong Kong experienced a period of rapid economic growth. From 1961 to 71, the average growth rate is about 11% a year, making Hong Kong second only to Japan in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of income per capita. Hong Kong became a highly profitable venture for the empire. In 1967, Hong Kong's £350 million in reserves represented a third of all British reserves. However, since these profits directly benefited the crown, there was a strong incentive for the British to minimize public spending. Public works of the 1970s prioritized low tax over finishing public programs, which is especially critical to understanding why public campaigns were implemented over more structural and therefore costly public health reforms. The other major factor is this process of nationalism and this idea of becoming a Hong Konger. As China turned increasingly insular and its economy lagged behind that of Hong Kong's, Hong Kong citizens increasingly identify themselves as Hong Kong people of Chinese descent, as opposed to Chinese citizens. Public hygiene and sanitation, as a symbol of cleanliness, represented Hong Kong's economic, social, and even moral development ahead of the mainland. Hong Kong citizens became responsive to calls to action based on civic pride and responsibility as a means of self-distinction. In accordance with this development of this new Hong Kong national identity, we see a growing participation of citizens in political life. The Urban Council in the 1960s was the only branch of Hong Kong government in which some form of democratic elections were held. And so for Chinese citizens such as Dr. Denny Huang, Wilfred Wang Xingbing, and Wilson Wang represented a new cohort of wealthy or learned counselors who had immigrated to Hong Kong in the 1940s and 50s, became wealthy, and now sat on public health committees in the Urban Council. Dr. Huang was the campaign leader, and the development and the rise of these figures really indicate the appeal of public health as a means of national self-strengthening for emerging Hong Kong nationalists of the time. Additionally, we also have a major international factor, which was these challenges to colonial rule. In the 1970s, tensions began brewing between Britain and China over the fate of Hong Kong past Britain's lease period in 1997. By building up Hong Kong not only economically but also socially, Britain could mount a more credible challenge against China over Hong Kong's sovereignty. As said by Governor Murray MacLehose as he entered office, "My object in Hong Kong must be to ensure that conditions in Hong Kong are so superior in every way to those of China that the Central People's Government will hesitate before facing the problems of absorption." In other words, the colonial government recognized that social reforms could facilitate Hong Kong nationalism, which would complicate the reabsorption of Hong Kong into the mainland. So under MacLehose's tenure, we saw these public health campaigns. We also saw these kind of corruption purging campaigns within the police force and public parks reforms and stuff like that. And all of these reforms served as a political purpose within the context of empirical control. So kind of in conclusion, extravagant, political, and occasionally health-focused, the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign of the 1972 was a public health hygiene campaign that spoke heavily to its social, economic, and political contexts. Okay, so just some of my concluding thoughts. Efforts by the colonial administration to reform public health reflects a unique point of time in Hong Kong's history. The British administration, facing social, political, and economic pressures to decolonize, combined with Cold War geopolitical considerations, looked to population-based health reforms with renewed optimism and urgency. At the same time, Hong Kong's emerging role as an economic center in East Asia, combined with different systems of governments in Hong Kong and mainland China, fostered the creation of a unique national identity that encouraged a new generation of citizens to implement and partake in self-strengthening initiatives. This nexus of colonialism and nationalism that existed across the 1950s and 70s in Hong Kong no longer holds true. No longer a developing city with limited public health infrastructure caught between a battle between European, American, and Chinese international powers, the same appeals to self-strengthening and national colonialism perhaps hold less urgency than they once did. As the new administration inherits new and old public health and sanitation problems, such as population aging, medical doctor shortage, pollution, and waste disposal shortages, it will be interesting to see if and how the administration recruits its citizens into the public health and sanitation process. Thank you.
How does a nation imagine itself, its future, and its fellow citizens after 45 years of imperial colonization? Lithuania's capacity to imagine was let loose in the late 1980s. In the wake of Gorbachev's reforms that allowed greater freedom of speech, public's national sentiments started to resurface and take shape. In this zeitgeist, the moment that is now called the national rebirth took place, even before the prospect of Lithuania's independence from the Soviet Union became a certainty. The underlying idea of my project is the attempt to piece together a national idea to which Lithuanians subscribed to in the late 1980s. This question is particularly pertinent as as the understanding of the idea of nationhood is particularly important to underline the political trajectory of a post-independence Lithuania, especially in regards to the nationalities question. In the late 1980s and throughout its history, Lithuania has never been a homogeneous country, with large numbers of Poles, Russians, Jews, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Tatars, calling this country a home for decades. All of its residents were anxious to derive a common denominator to define Lithuanian as in the late 1980s. And it's very important to mention that after Lithuania regained its independence in 1990, in contrast to other Baltic republics, Lithuania adopted what is now called a zero-option citizenship law, meaning that this country granted citizenship to all of its residents. And while, of course, there are a number of factors that contributed to this distinctive decision in the context of the Baltic states, I would like to hypothesize that the idea and the concept of nationhood to which people subscribed in the late 1980s also had a role to play. So how I am gathering this public opinion on the idea of nationhood in the late 1980s? And the answer, as always, rests in the archives. So in the Lithuanian state archives, I have discovered a collection of letters written in 1988 and 1989. And these letters are addressed to Lithuanian Reformation movement, also known as Sąjūdis. And Sąjūdis was also a product of Gorbachev's reforms. So with the newly found freedom, the Lithuanians organized into this movement to advocate for national questions. One of them early on was whether Lithuanian language should be announced as the official language of the Lithuanian Soviet Republic. So at first, the Lithuanian Reformation movement didn't really have the agenda of achieving independence. Of course, later on, it recalibrated its goals. And of course, this movement was the driving force that brokered the independence deal. But what happened in the zeitgeist of newly found political freedom, people started writing letters to the Reformation movement. And the best way for me to describe to you those letters is the American concept, writing a letter to your senator. Well, of course, Sąjūdis in 1988 did not really have political power per se, but it had some features of political representation. So it was kind of aggregating the popular interests and trying to advocate for them in the best of their abilities. So what I discovered in the archives are more than 100 letters written by different peoples from different walks of life, from factory workers to doctors to philosophy professors to supporters of Sąjūdis and its staunchest opponents. And those people were expressing their opinions about a wide range of questions, from environmentalism to language politics to which monument to build where. But the common thread in those letters emerged to be the search of the common national identity on the brink of the country's independence. So my research goals are twofold. First, I try to identify narratives shaping national thinking on the brink of Lithuania's independence from the Soviet Union. And second, I try to explore how this imagining of nationhood was tailored to include ethno-linguistic minorities living in Lithuania at the time. For me to be able to discuss those letters and to draw the patterns that emerge from them, I must bore you with a quick crash course on Lithuania's history. And of course, I can't possibly do justice to this history in now I have 15 minutes left. So I have picked 3 historical moments that I think are very important for my discussion of the notion of nationhood that emerged in the late 1980s. So first, I would like to talk about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So this is the first Lithuanian medieval state. And there are three important or main things that I would like to talk about this state. So first, it was, up until 14th century, it was a pagan state. And and as a result of it being one of the last pagan strongholds in Europe, it became a target for Teutonic Knights and their crusades in an attempt to convert the pagan Lithuanians into Christianity. So in Lithuania's historiography, there is this very prominent story of fighting the Teutonic Knights, suffering from the Teutonic Knights, but eventually defeating them in the great battle of Grunwald of 1410. Then Lithuania was a massive state. So at its point of greatest might, it stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And the greatest expansion happened in the 14th century, integrating the modern-day territories of Belarus and Ukraine. And as a result of this rapid and extensive expansion, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was, of course, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-confessional state. But what was interesting, that from the early days of the Grand Duchy, the Grand Duchy espoused its commitment to multiculturalism and religious tolerance. And of course, this should be taken with a grain of salt. But the symbol of this commitment to multiculturalism and religious tolerance are the preserved letters of Duke Gediminas, who is also the founder of the modern-day Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. So after the Grand Duke founded the city, he started writing these letters to all the European capitals, inviting merchants and intellectuals to move to Vilnius under the promise of religious and cultural tolerance. Then we have a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or as it's sometimes known in Lithuanian, the Great Betrayal. So in 1569, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy joined forces and created what we now would call the bi-confederal state. And although the state is known for its also expansive territory and enlightened, or what people say ahead of its time, political system, the parliament of noblemen who actually elected the king, and also the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the state responsible for the first European constitution, but also entrenched the principles of religious and cultural tolerance in its laws. But there is a big but. And in the late 18th, 19th century, some of the Lithuanian nationalists began to develop a sort of resentment to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this resentment stemmed from the fact that Polish culture, language, and could say the political thought was starting to dominate the Commonwealth. And just a little illustration of this resentment develop, of the causes of the resentment, you can see to the left the painting that is commemorating the union, the Polish-Lithuanian Union. And of course, you have the coat of arms of both states. And then the writing underneath says the eternal union, but it only says it in Polish. So in the 19th century, this became to be seen as the founding of the Commonwealth, as a betrayal of Lithuania's sovereign, pure tradition of might. Eventually, the Commonwealth was partitioned out of existence, and modern-day Lithuanian territory was annexed by the Russian Empire. And as a result of that, Lithuania was subjected to Russification policies. Those were in response to the nationalist rebellions and nationalist movements who actively opposed the imperial control. And the Russification policies could be mainly characterized by the ban on Lithuanian language. So Lithuanian could not be taught, nor books and periodicals could not be published in Lithuanian Latin letters. So this historical juncture of imperial occupation, Russification policies also came at the time of the rise of nationalism in Europe. And of course, the Herderian ideas of going back to the people, documenting the vernacular cultures, traditions, and languages also started to trickle down to Lithuania. And in this time, you have what is now called the Romantic period of nationalism in Lithuania. So the early Romantic Lithuanian nationalists attempted to nationalize the nation, so try to break away its historical ties from Poland, and of course try to physically free the country from the imperial Russian occupation. So how does all of this historical background of centuries of history relate to the letters? So what emerged in those letters that I read that were written in the late 1980s is that people related to each other a lot through the trope of national suffering. And of course, this idea was not new, or it was not invented in the late 1980s. It was actually, I would say, a Soviet idea. So Nerija Putinaitė, a great Lithuanian scholar who writes a lot about the cultural Soviet nationalism, she named this phenomena a Soviet emotional regime. And what emotional regime entails is creation of a mental aesthetic space where people can experience or meditate on the experiences of national suffering coming from the Teutonic Knights, coming from the loss of sovereign might, from being integrated, founding a common state of Poland. And by meditating on this historical suffering, this creates some sort of cognitive link between the trope of suffering and the imagining of nationhood. But the underlying idea of this Soviet-style emotional regime was that communism held the promise of salvation to all of his historical suffering. So in the letters written to Lithuanian Reformation movement, every other letter had the mentioning of some sort of suffering. But what was unique about these narratives of suffering was that they advocated for regaining of national memory, regaining autonomy over what memories can be remembered. And of course, the main emphasis in those letters constituted people's desire to make the memory of Stalinist deportations into history proper. And it's very important to acknowledge that this particular memory could not be talked about under Gorbachev's predecessors. While this is not a shocking discovery that people wanted to talk about the traumatic experiences that were silenced for so long, what interestingly happens is that this account of suffering that started to emerge and people start to talk about it creates what Michael Rothberg called a multidirectional memory. So multidirectional memory marks the phenomenon when the articulation of one history of suffering provides resources and resonance to other accounts of injustices across national and cultural context. And this is exactly what happens in those archival letters. As people start talking about the Stalinist deportations, the narratives of historical suffering caused by the Holocaust or Tatar genocide also start to mirror the same narrative. And I would dare to argue that in the late 1980s, most Lithuanians, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of which language they spoke at home, related to this idea of being a deportee, in one way or another, being uprooted from their culture, language, and tradition. Another interesting thing that emerges from the letters is this consensus on which historical tradition should be embraced in this newly found period of national rebirth. And the letters overwhelmingly indicate that people really liked the tradition of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And Anthony Smith argues that every national rebirth requires a selection of a golden age, a pure period of history where men were heroes. And in the context of late 1980s, it is important to mention that ethnic tensions were kind of starting to rise in Lithuania. And This was, of course, motivated by the rise of Sąjūdis, because it was perceived as an exclusively ethnic Lithuanian movement who only represented ethnic Lithuanians. And of course, this angered or made anxious Polish and Russian minorities. So Sąjūdis, understanding this and seeing this distress in the society, tried to come up with a strategy of how to appease ethnic minorities and kind of create this common goal and common narrative. And their choice was to resort to the historical tradition of a Grand Duchy. So in Sąjūdis' own rhetoric and in the letters themselves, people talk about the great might of a Grand Duchy. And what is significant, that we don't only talk about its expansion, its expansive territory or great dukes, but we talk how this might was the result of the multi-ethnic and multicultural nature of this empire, of this Grand Duchy. And another interesting thing that emerges in those letters is that people try to find the reason why ethnic tensions are manifesting itself now in the late 1980s. And the common thread that emerges in those letters is the argument that Lithuania has always been a multicultural and very tolerant state, but the country has been robbed of its golden age of tolerance. And of course, it was robbed by foreign actors. So first, the attempts were made by the Teutonic Knights, then it was the Poles, then it was the Germans, then it was the Russians. So what people agreed to in the late 1980s, that they need to go back to the historical tradition of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania before the corruption of the foreign actors happened. So to conclude, I would like to draw on the ideas of the author of the first book in Lithuanian language, Martynas Mažvydas. So in 1547, he defined Lithuanian as these are the last years of a Grand Duchy. And he said, a Lithuanian is someone who loves freedom and abides by the Lithuanian statute of Grand Duchy. And I think this quote speaks a lot to the idea of national rebirth. So national rebirth both presupposes continuity and transformation. And I think this is exactly what happened to Lithuania in the late 1980s. People took the old tradition of a Grand Duchy, and they took the currently existing trope of suffering, and they reinvented it or created space to make these narratives to promote a more inclusive idea of nationhood. Thank you.
So the great 20th century writer Saul Bellow once said that they're only believers and idolaters, implying that there's no way to escape the influence of the numinous. It seems that nowhere is this more true than in India, where the influence of myth and mythic consciousness is still present in political life, giving shape to its current national self-understanding. To say that India is locked in a struggle against competing forces for its soul is entirely justified, though many understand this current Kulturkampf to be between the Indian right, particularly the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and an alternative vision for a secular Indian democracy. There is, however, a third element I will include, that being the rise of what I will call the globalist anti-culture, a perceived reductionist materialist culture that seeks to undo India's hard-won attempts to develop a national identity in the wake of independence. The mobilization of the Indian right has increased in fervor in the past decade or so, at least in part due to attempts to protect itself from this globalist anti-culture, an import understood to be linked to American consumerism and distinctly Western secularized discourse. The globalist anti-culture positions itself in opposition to both the secular project and the Indian right, and that it does not have a concrete vision for the identity of India, and is more likely to result in a westernized uniformity of culture, rather than political and sociocultural change within the parameters of India's pre-established national identity. The Indian view of secularism Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, first Prime Minister of India, aimed and advocated for, was one where the state remained equidistant from all faiths, and which would result in the preservation, he hoped, of a multi-religious India. This attempt to maintain religious harmony and fight against communalism was always in conflict with the oppositional view that India was a majoritarian state, a nation-state, where the large country, Hindus, must dominate over the little country, which comprised other faiths. I wish to argue that myth remains crucial to understanding India and its implications for this current culture war, especially in regard to India's class structures, her national identity, and her law. I especially want to consider myth in the context of the neo-Kantian philosopher Ernst Cassier's work, as I believe that in using his highly penetrating account of myth, we can better understand the nature of myth's enduring reach. So, in looking at Cassier's work, I'll be drawing from both his Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Volume 2 on Myth, and his later book, The Myth of the State. So, Cassier strongly believed myth to be a phenomenon worthy of philosophical examination, that it was a system with particular laws and its own internal logic. He builds upon, though later rejects on the grounds of inadequacy, Kant's architectonic methodology, particularly the idea that a determination of the way an object is begins with an analysis of reason. Cassier went beyond Kant's focus on analyzing perception in empirical science, positing that every major form of culture, religion, language, art, history, science, and myth, has its own objectivity. Objectivity meaning independence caused from the bias of perception. He would argue, for example, against an anthropological study that sees myth as a set of irrational behaviors that can at best be taxonomized. So, this question of myth for Cassier is connected to the ability to symbolize, a symbol being a sensuous and intellectual medium through which thought appears. What this means on a basic level is that it is a means of mediating and understanding our world, much like language. It also suggests that myth can and does have a serious role in political life, often influencing conceptions of national identity, like in the case of India. So, in regards to the relationship between myth and history, the development of the national identity, I believe, cannot occur without first tracing the origins of a country back to its ultimate starting point. We'll recall the account of Rome's founding, the Cain and Abel-esque story of Romulus and Remus fighting it out. So it's arguably at this juncture, so the juncture of the creation myth, that myth and history touch. Indeed, a Casserian approach distinguishes between myth and the modern, read academic, understanding of history in the following way. The myth articulates the basic self-understanding of a people, contains rules for guidance, and enforces morality and norms. On the other hand, history is a chronological understanding of events relevant to a specific discipline, geographical location, or living entity. A Casserian understanding of mythical stories tends to highlight the moral lessons of these stories because of the logic of mythical perception he elucidates. For Cassier, mythical thinking is characterized by an immediacy of perception that prevents the possibility of causal analysis. Lacking the categories of time and space, association becomes a powerful force, including between moral ideas and characters, events and places. Because of the power of association, mythical stories have this one-to-one mapping between the narrative and the outcome. A history with a normative slant will still have to prove, via causal argument, the connection between the character, the event, and the ultimate good. Thus, mythical stories, because of the immediacy of mythical perception and the highly associative psychology it creates, are almost necessarily inflected with a moral sense. So next, I wish to argue that India's particular conception of identity is deeply rooted in a mythic consciousness in its reliance and relationship to the Hindu timescale, and the continuing cultural significance of his mythic texts. So, according to the Hindu timescale, creation is a never-ending cycle, and there are 4 ages of man, which are called yugas. The Golden Age, or the Satya Yuga, is the age where, similar to Greek mythology, gods mingled freely with men. Then comes the Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, then the Dvapara Yuga, the Bronze Age. We're now about 5,000 years into the Age of Darkness, or the Kali Yuga. At the end of this Kali Yuga, the cycles will regenerate. They'll begin all over again. So each yuga is characterized, interestingly, by a specific moral dimension, as each age is marked by a proportionate diminishing of dharma, which can be defined as the conceptually interconnected system that comprises and deals with universal law, a religious sense of righteousness, social duties, and subtle phenomena that are the constituent elements of all of existence. Dharma is at its most basic a moral law governing individual conduct. This cyclical teleological view of history is understood in the context of the Yuga timescale, is in harmony with Cassir's nonlinear teleological view, where the symbol reaches beyond the theoretical concept. These teleological constructions set themselves in opposition to a contingent view of contemporary history and historiography, the academic sense, which requires one to consider events in a chronology. Indian myth eschews contingency due to the applicability of myth's logic to all situations, making all outcomes necessarily possible, in a way. Using our understanding of Cassir, we can see that the idea of the allegory, which in a non-teleological system controls contingency by fixing on a psychological core that orients responses to novel circumstance through fixed fictional figures, becomes real rather than imagined. As Cassir says, rites are not originally allegorical. They do not merely copy or represent, but they are absolutely real. They are woven into the reality of action as to form an indispensable part of it. An example of this, a quote from the national epic of India, the Mahabharata, ends with this quote: "What is found in the poem I have recited may be found elsewhere, but anything it does not contain will be found nowhere." The poem has, in a sense, accounted for all possibilities of reality, at least all of its most important aspects, and it contains within it, in a way, all possible laws. And so myth is definitive in creating the moral law. But what exactly is the moral law in the Indian context? Returning to the concept of the Yuga timescale, the idea that time and space are fields of unequal quality, prone to giving rise to different results with regard to moral character, is of great cultural significance. The fact that our current age is an age of darkness may lead to the belief in a diminishing capacity for dharma and justice. Note that this does not make the Kali Yuga a time of moral agnosticism, just moral pessimism. Of course, we would expect this gradual diminishing of a moral foundation to have direct implications on political life. Broadly speaking, there may be less faith in change, less desire to fix things when perceived in this mythic context. Cultural movements, most notably the movement I have termed the globalist anti-culture, this bulwark of Western consciousness, it does not exhibit this teleological thinking endemic to Indian consciousness, which means that it may struggle to gain power in India. So, assuming we take this teleological conception seriously, what implications does myth have directly on public and political life? I think the Hindu caste system is an essential example of this interplay between myth and everyday life. The term caste was applied to Indian society in the 17th century by the Portuguese, though the seeds of the Indian caste system were sown about 3,000 years ago, around 1500 BC, when the Aryans are supposed to have invaded the subcontinent and conquered the Dravidians, imposing their culture, language, and religion, which they're the Vedic religion, which later became Hinduism as we now understand it. The caste system is divided into 4 primary castes: the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. The beneath these is the Dalit caste, known as untouchables because they are considered ritually unclean. In terms of how myth features in this, the earliest record of caste is in the 10th 10th chapter of the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the 4 sacred canonical texts of Hinduism, the Vedas, which are a collection of Vedic Sanskrit hymns in praise of the gods, and which is actually one of the oldest extant texts in any Indo-European language. The Rig Veda discusses how the caste system was created by sacrificing the primal cosmic being, Purusha, who begot the Brahmins from his mouth, the Kshatriyas from his arms, the Vaishyas from his thighs, and the Shudras from his feet. The Dalits, as they are currently understood, do not feature in this account. As Kassir writes, it is not so much man who is formed from parts of the world, Purusha, as the world from parts of man. The unity of macrocosm and microcosm infers a unity of origin. This story of the creation of human beings we just heard is one with the story of the creation of caste. Also, in the first Hindu legal text, the Manusmriti, Manu, the Adamic first man and architect of Hindu society, divides the Hindus into the 4 varnas, granting privileges to the higher castes and imposing penalties on the lower. Some of the most salient prohibitions are: a Shudra is unfit to receive education. The upper varnas should not impart education or give advice to a Shudra. It is not necessary that the Shudra should know the laws and codes, and hence need not be taught. Violators will go to hell. Another is: a Shudra who insults a twice-born man with gross invectives shall have his tongue cut out, for he is of low origin. Lastly, the most sacred duty of a Shudra is to serve the upper castes, always reciting the words Brahman with utmost devotion. Such a Shudra will gain salvation. Otherwise, he will die the worst death and will go to the worst hell. So though caste has been banned by the Indian Constitution for decades, it remains a powerful part of Indian society. In particular, we see that its weight comes in part from its association with the mythic story of its creation. Further examples of mythic thinking are contained in the previously mentioned Mahabharata, a monolith of a text that still serves as a guidebook for Indian life. It does so by showing how tragically people's lives can end if they fail to obey traditional cultural norms, especially since it is a story in which nobody survives. While modern Indians are divided on whether all the events described in the Mahabharata and the Vedas did truly come to pass, it's difficult to overstate the power of the Mahabharata and in the way in which it impacts the fabric of India's culture. A crucial element of the Indian mytho-historical relationship is in the exhibition of myth as reality. Indeed, the Sanskrit word itihasa, which literally means "so indeed it was," is another word for history, though it is used to describe the Mahabharata. There is also a belief that the Mahabharata was written by human beings who had been granted a divine vision, which rendered their text inerrant, the literal word of an omniscient god or a fully enlightened mortal being. However, the ethics prescribed in it are not always concurrent with our contemporary understanding of equality and progress, seen as essential for democracy. I'll provide a couple examples. In the 13th book of the Mahabharata, the book of instruction, it tells the story of Matanga, a young man who believes himself to be a Brahmin, until, after mercilessly whipping a foal, he is told by the mother ass that he is actually the son of a Brahmin and a Chandala, belonging to the Shudra lower castes. Matanga is obviously shocked, and he strives to do anything in his power in order to become a Brahmin in this life. However, even after standing on one foot for 1,000 years, he is told that nothing he does in this life will earn him that greatest of mortal rewards. Upward mobility is ultimately impossible in this mythic context. The second story is taken from the Ramayana, an epic set in an earlier yuga, thousands of years before. Rama, the virtuous king of the epic, encounters an elderly Brahmin who blames him for his son's death. And Rama, upon consulting a sage, is informed that the boy's death is the fault of the Shudra practicing penances nearby. After confronting the Shudra, who insists he's performing his rigorous penance in order to attain the celestial region, Rama cuts off his head, earning the praise of the gods. The last book of the Ramayana, the Uttarakhanda, is often not published when translated because of what people see to be offensive, very offensive content, especially regarding the story. So these myths still affect the Indian psyche today. According to the National Geographic, every hour 2 Dalits are assaulted. Every day 3 Dalit women are raped, 2 Dalits are murdered, and 2 Dalit homes are torched. According to the BBC, Dalit women are among the most oppressed in the world. Now, discussing myth and nationalism would be impossible without touching on the dominant philosophy of Indian nationalism, Hindutva. The philosophy of Hindutva began with Veer Savarkar, an Indian nationalist who wanted to provide a definition of the core of Indian identity that drew on its religious and cultural past. He was inspired chiefly by Giuseppe Mazzini, the 19th century Italian nationalist whose writings fueled the Risorgimento, and whose romantic nationalism was characterized by a belief in the spiritual harmony and brotherhood of nations, and an almost contradictory universalism which built unity on the national principle. Upon comparing their manifestos, they were very alike in revolutionary zeal and passion, although Savarkar wanted to go even further than Mazzini, answering his call to grandeur with a call for sovereignty. Buddhistic logic could not defeat the Huns. Up with Vedic Dharma, back to the Vedas, insisted Savarkar. Only knowledge of the Vedas, of the Gita, an episode of the Mahabharata, and the violent zeal it inspired could save India. The Hindu warrior must take up his sword, rejecting the peaceful tenets of Buddhism, and take back his land, according to Savarkar. The most salient aspect of Savarkar's Hindutva is that commitment to Hinduness requires recognizing India's sacredness. He writes, "In the case of some of our Mohammedan or Christian countrymen who had originally been forcibly converted to a non-Hindu religion and who consequently have inherited, along with Hindus, a common fatherland and a greater part of the wealth of a common culture, language, law, customs, folklore, and history, they are not yet and cannot be recognized as Hindus. For though Hindustan to them is fatherland as to any other Hindu, it is not to them a holy land. Their mythology and godmen are not the children of this soil. Their love is divided." Hindutva does not simply propose that one needs a substantive identity in order to feel kinship with one's motherland. It implies that the further you are from a Hindu consciousness and sensibility, the more you are a second or even third-class citizen, for you cannot really believe India to be your holy land. If you push Hindutva to its logical conclusion, it results in the idea that Christians and Muslims and non-Hindus broadly are not fully capable of being loyal to their country, which is exactly what has happened in the last 50 or so years, this perception. So, in the strongest example of the encroaching of myth on public life is probably the case of the Babri Masjid, a 16th century mosque which was destroyed in the early 90s because it was believed to be the site of the birthplace of Hindu god Rama, the hero of the Ramayana, the second book of which is set in Ayodhya. It was destroyed by an organized mob of over 75,000 Hindu volunteers who tore it down while the Indian authorities stood on the sidelines. In the aftermath of this destruction, a legal case was filed by Muslims, Hindus, and finally by the god Rama himself, as in Hindu law, Hindu idols are juristic entities whose trustees can file lawsuits on their behalf. The crime and the legal response, then, were to a great degree influenced by myth, and it illustrates how sincere mythic conviction can go so far as to become codified in the law. A more contemporary example of the way in which the lines between mythic consciousness and a manifestation of the law has blurred is the Garwapsi, or reconversion law. For over 10 years, the government of India, the right-wing government, has incentivized people to leave the Christian, Muslim, Parsi religions, as well as other religions, with a campaign to facilitate the conversion of these other faiths back to Hinduism. Also, as recently as 2019, the Indian Parliament has amended the original 1955 Citizenship Act in order to facilitate religious in order to facilitate citizenship for religious minorities, specifically Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, who entered India prior to 2015. However, the Act does not extend to Muslim minorities. We see that we can trace the genealogy of these laws from myth through Hindutva to the present day. This realistic use of political myth, with the amalgamation of race worship, hero worship, and state worship, has enormous implications for India. This mythic and political unity allows one to define the people as one amalgam. And when you dispense with having to consult with real people as authentic representatives, then you don't have to actually bother with democratic principles. There is no doubt that the mythic pervades Indian life. And I have tried to show that these myths do not rest superficially atop more material causes, and that mythic perception can be just as concrete as economic and social forces. And evidence of this reality is present in the nature of India's social class, national identity, and legal system. Finally, the Indian struggle to develop a national identity must navigate the challenge of mediating in between these three forces competing for supremacy: Hindu nationalism, secularism, and the globalist anti-culture. Thinking towards India's general election next year, I believe a crucial question to consider is whether this mythic state of mind is compatible with liberal democracy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. You will, of course, immediately ask, how could anybody respond to 3 papers of such diversity? Well, I'm glad to tell you I'm supremely qualified to do so. I did my PhD on the Asiatic mode of production, Oriental despotism, and Indian history. I did it I was supervised by and examined by Ernest Gellner, the theorist of nationalism. And I have visited Hong Kong, Singapore, Indonesia, other sites of the Chinese diaspora. That doesn't mean anything I say is going to be correct. It does mean that I have some grounds for what I say. So I'd like to begin by asking what the papers have in common. And what they have in common is some reference to nations and nationalism. And what I'm going to do is pose questions to each person that arise out of these general considerations. So one question that arises in all papers, 2 directly and 1 indirectly, is the importance of a usable past. So in the case of Lithuania, you heard from Vita, a clear elaboration of 3 possible models of the Lithuanian past which could have been drawn upon. Notably, she omitted the history of World War II, when Jews are massacred because of their association with communism. And the association was real. Communists overrepresented Jews in large parts of Eastern Europe. And you heard her give an account of why the Duchy of Lithuania was an appropriate resource to draw upon, not simply because of its scale and power, but because it gave a usable, multicultural, multi-confessional past, which contemporary civic nationalists in Lithuania could employ. More grimly, you heard from Miriam about how the BJP in particular exploits myths, including Hindutva myths, in order to justify their current politics of demonizing Muslims in particular, but also mobilizing a Hindu majority against multiple minorities. And in doing so, they accuse their opponents, particularly the Congress Party, of having a long history of pandering to minorities. And that accounts for such current outrages as the maltreatment of the Kashmiris, who have had their autonomy, which was present in the Indian constitution, removed. It accounts for multiple other forms of illiberalism which Miriam documented. Hong Kong. Isn't it a problem for you, Sophie, that there is no usable past for so-called Hong Kong nationalism? It's a novel city-state constructed under imperial auspices, indeed with many of the negligent qualities that you identified in its earlier period. And in case you thought otherwise, the mistake often happens. I'm not British, and you're not going to hear an apology for British imperialism. I am rather like Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett was once asked, are you English? To which he replied, en français, au contraire. And to be Irish is indeed to be contrary to being English. So the question I have to pose to you is, wasn't it a problem for Hong Kong that they lacked any mythic resources, ethnic resources that could tell them a story about how it was appropriate for Hong Kong to develop into a potential nation state? We know that it's feasible because Singapore managed to do it. And that's my second question for you. Singapore successfully implemented enormous and rigorous public health programs. And it did so because Lee Kuan Yew went to University College London. University College London, if you look at it, if you go in the entrance, there's an effigy of Jeremy Bentham. Now, secular people are not supposed to engage in the deification of secular scholars, but University College London has a stuffed effigy of Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham recommended for public policy ferocious penalties credibly applied for things that you don't like. And if those penalties are sufficiently ferocious, people will respond and behave well. So Lee Kuan Yew applied that in Singapore. It's the only place on earth I've been where there are big signs telling you that if you do not flush the public toilet, you will face a fine of 500 Singapore dollars. And there's credible enforcement of those deterrents. There's watching eyes. There's a sense that everywhere there are cameras, and no doubt the locals will tell if you fail to flush the toilet properly. So I was especially vigilant in flushing the urinal in Singapore in a way that perhaps I'm not as vigilant in the United States. Now, I say this not to talk about urinals at length, but rather to emphasize that this is an example of a post-colonial, Chinese-run city-state implementing exactly the same public health reforms as the British were doing. So there's something about global time here. There's something about what's happening that I think can be decoupled in principle from questions of colonial rule in Hong Kong. There's a general question of how do you manage densely populated public cities in the tropics? How do you exploit modern knowledge and medicine to be more effective than the old techniques of quarantining? So I say this not in any way to exculpate past British conduct in Hong Kong or anywhere else, but to suggest that if you made other Chinese comparisons, then maybe your claims about colonial and national questions would have somewhat stronger credibility to external audiences. Vita, you have a problem with alternative explanations, right? So Latvia and Estonia also had Russian-speaking minorities. And you tell a nice story. Here are all these Lithuanians, and you've got a great story to tell because you've got this archive of people writing before the key moment in history. And this tells you that they are actually drawing upon mythic and genuine historical resources in making arguments for the present. But the comparative question then imposes itself on you. Why do the Lithuanians go for a benign past, whereas the Latvians and the Estonians are tougher on the Russians? They have a more exclusionary citizenship law. Now, it can't be that it can't just be, I believe, that the Lithuanians have a special penchant for going back to generous interpretations of their history, which the Estonians and the Latvians lack. There are more brutal material facts at play here. If I'm right, I think the Lithuanians had the smallest proportion of Russian speakers. The advantage of a minority being small is that you can be benign to it. That doesn't mean you automatically will be. Look at India. It's not benign towards its Muslim minority. But if a minority is proportionally small, it is possible to be more benign towards it. And I think that's a key factor in looking at the three cases. Missing from your story, if I recall reading it correctly, is the fact that, if I recall correctly, immediately at the moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Poles were very badly received inside Lithuania. Why? Was it because of the memory of the past Commonwealth, that which you called a biconfederal state? I don't think it was a biconfederal state. It was definitely a bi-state. But was it a confederation? We can discuss that at another time, and I welcome you to attend my course in which we carefully distinguish between confederations, personal unions, and federations. That's not material. What I am saying is that there was a much more immediate reason for why Lithuanians were ungenerously disposed towards Poles. And those of you who are familiar with the recent history of Eastern Europe will know what that is. Namely, the Poles in certain concentrated parts of Lithuania welcomed the coup against Gorbachev in 1991. And that was not forgotten by the Lithuanians, quite reasonably so. But that has an implication, and the implication is we are more likely to be triggered emotionally, intellectually, in political mobilization by more recent behavior than long ago past behavior. So the Poles were not targeted because they had suppressed Lithuanian culture in the course of the Commonwealth, but because they were collaborators with the worst kinds of Soviet revanchism, right? So those are some challenges for you. And lastly, I'm going to challenge Miriam. Do you need Cassirer? He's obscure. He's extremely difficult to read. He can be read in many, many ways. He's lovely if you're a literary critic, not obliged to conform to the positivist standards of social science. So I can understand why he might be tempting. But do you need him at all? The story you tell, broadly speaking, that's relevant for the present is that the BJP certainly exploits Hindu-Vata mythology. You don't, I think, need Cassirer to explain Hindu-Vata ideology, which is strongly linked both to a defense of Hinduism and to a defense of the caste order. Now, the reason I'm going in this direction is if you think about India, it's a post-colonial democracy with British-style institutions. It has the same electoral system as other backward democracies. And before you're offended, one of those backward democracies is the United States. Now, in backward democracies, the electoral system is winner takes all in single-member districts. The backward democracies that I have in mind are the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and India. Not typically put together, but they are all distinguished by the presence of this electoral system. What does it do? It creates very strong incentives for parties to form across the Union as a whole. And it creates strong incentives to win a minimum winning coalition. The way you do that in India, after the initial successes of Congress in mobilizing across the continent against the British imperial power, is to target the largest group and hope that you can build a sufficient constituency in it, and deliberately distance yourself from the meso, middle-sized, and the micro-minorities. And broadly speaking, that is what the BJP has been able to do. With roughly 30 to 35% of the reliable vote, it is able to win huge parliamentary majorities. And the secret of its electoral success is both Congress's previous failures in general public policy, but also its ability to say, we stand for the majority. So India is a currently awful example of how you can accomplish majority dominance through institutional incentives that exist as a result of a different kind of legacy, a legacy left by the British, and a legacy that has nothing to do with historic myths. So as a political scientist, I would look first to the institutions. And the challenge to all of you, and this is to all of you, Ernest Gellner argued in Nations and Nationalism in the following way, and I'm not telling you what my opinion is on it, but this is how he argued. He said, it doesn't matter what the past was. He indeed quotes Gilbert and Sullivan. There's a song in one of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas where somebody says, it's a thing of shreds and patches. Whatever is available can be exploited in the present. But it's to the present that we should engage in analysis. We should think about the use of the past as the currently operative cause, and not the past itself as somehow an operative cause. Thank you. Should I stay here, or should I sit beside them for conversation? Because obviously this represents hierarchical authority as I dictate from on high. I'm going to grab a seat and sit beside you. We can continue the conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much for your questions. Does this work? Maybe. Okay. I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the big challenges about talking about Hong Kong's cultural heritage, or Hong Kong like a unique national identity, is that there's not a historical precedent for it. You know, you might say they speak Cantonese, but so do many provinces in the Guangdong region. You know, Hong Kong was kind of assembled in a very piecemeal way, where you have Hong Kong Island first in the First Opium War, and then you have the Kowloon area, and then the new territories is kind of pushed a bit further later. So there's not a notable kind of geographic break or cultural break between Hong Kong and China's kind of longer history. But it is also the case that many scholars kind of attribute the 1970s as a turning point for Hong Kong national identity, in the sense that you kind of see this kind of mythic idea of Hong Kong citizens as being somehow distinct from the mainland, either in their work ethic or their cultural values, or their kind of ability to model a success story of essence. And I think this is especially true in the way immigration is kind of talked about. So part of the reason why there was a huge wave of immigration in the 1940s and 50s is because there's virtually a very porous border up to this point. You know, like a lot of immigrants who came from mainland China to Hong Kong before 1950 immigrated because they had chains of families that were able to kind of help them out and get established. But by the 1970s, you see kind of a very strict closed border idea. You see a lot of rhetoric about fear that Chinese citizens are somehow taking up resources or coming in with kind of their uncivilized, unpracticed manner. And this is the kind of rhetoric that is extended to present day in Hong Kong. If you think about the way in which many, to avoid broad generalization, many Hong Kong citizens discuss their mainland Chinese counterparts. Common jokes I've heard, I think, growing up is like, oh yeah, like Chinese people spit in the streets, or they'll pee in the streets, and other kind of rhetoric in this way to indicate that there's somehow a kind of a civilizational divide between the two of them. I think that is something which has its roots in the kind of colonial experience, and how that kind of colonial experience shaped a distinctive growing up, but that's kind of like been morphed within the kind of Hong Kong rhetoric as being somehow an innate kind of person-to-person like fundamental difference, as opposed to kind of a product of these broader colonial or historic kind of processes. And I absolutely agree with your point about the kind of cross-Pacific hygiene movements of the 1950s and 70s. I know when I was reading newspapers about the Keep Hong Kong Clean campaign, there was literally references to how Singapore was doing their cleanup campaigns. So you're absolutely right to talk about the kind of cross knowledge, divided knowledge gap things. But I think, as I make him an argument, is that like public health would have improved in the 1950s and 70s regardless of colonial nationalist developments, because cities get wealthier, there's greater medical knowledge, there's better understanding about how to handle certain diseases. But at the same time, the specific two public health campaigns which I selected, and the kind of major publicity and effort to kind of recruit citizens into that public health making process, represents a kind of unique sentiment that is kind of distinctive of kind of nationalist or colonialist ideas.
Well, I would also like to thank you for your wonderful comments, and I'm fully aware of my problem of being trapped in many alternative possible explanations. And of course, I think your comment about how inherently the situation in all three Baltic republics was radically different. And of course, there's a huge difference of accommodating an ethnic minority that comprises 20% versus almost 50% of the population. But I think you mentioned yourself that just because a minority is small doesn't necessarily mean that you will treat it nicer or that it will imply some sort of behavior. So, of course, I think that the more nuanced analysis of the nationalities policy and all the political and institutional events that led to the independence and the zero-option law must be conducted to truly discern what factors played what role. But I also think, and I also really like your idea of how history, whatever it might be, it can always be used. You just need to find the angle in the right way. But I also think that the choice of history is also political. And I think it also entails certain direction. And talking about recency of history, I think, well, Poles and Russians are both deemed very are deemed to have very complicated history in Lithuania. So I didn't really have time in my presentation, but of course, Poland annexed the capital, the heart of the country in 1920. Of course, we supported the autonomy in the late 1980s, but well, Russians were at the heart.
Is buried in
his heart was when they removed it. But yeah, so, and then the Russians at the same time, they're at the heart of the Soviet project that led to this almost 50 years of occupation. So I think both of those histories are rather recent, and you could argue that, oh, these ethnic minorities are worth to be punished for their participation in this history. So I think it is interesting that despite of this recency, this doesn't happen. And of course, understanding the physical caveats to it. So I think this could be interesting to see why certain choices on histories are being made.
Could I reply? Could I reply immediately with a thought that occurs? One thing you can learn from the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is be strong, treat your minorities well, and then you're less likely to be invaded and conquered by your neighbors. Now, the Lithuanians had good reason to know that story in ways that the Estonians and Latvians didn't, because they had never had polities. This reminds me, by the way, if I can go back to Hong Kong, Ernest Gellner and Anthony Smith, whom both Vita and I think Miriam mentioned, had a famous debate. And the debate was, do nations have navels? So you know what a navel is. In case you don't, it's a belly button. And do nations require navels is the question. Do they require mothers, fathers? Why does the question arise? Well, when Darwinism materialized on the scene in the 19th century, it was obviously a story of human evolution. And a question that popularizers of Darwinianism used to pose to Christians was, look at all these pictures you have of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve have navels. Well, if they have navels, they presumably had parents. There's a problem with your account. Where did Adam get his navel from? And the answer to that question given by the Christians was generally to say that God made Adam and Eve at home in the world, and to make them feel at home in the world, he had to assure them that the rocks were 1 million years old and that they had navels, that they came from parents. Now, when you think about it, the story about nations is the reverse story. Do nations need creation myths or not? Now, Gellner thought they didn't, because anything could be drawn upon. Smith's answer is, actually, no, it's extremely difficult to form a nation unless you have some genuine history to work with. So Anthony Smith would not be surprised that the British did not have a Hong Kong nationalist movement that they had to deal with. They could have, there's nothing in principle that could have stopped it, but he would have said Hong Kong didn't have a naval, therefore its prospects of becoming a nation were limited. Miriam.
Thank you so much for your introduction and for your question. So to respond sort of simply to the question of whether Kassir is necessary, I think that I don't believe that he is necessary in the sense that I don't think that one needs to sort of use Kassir to, or any other sort of philosopher of myth, for example, in order to sort of investigate the problem of India's national identity. Kassir was used primarily in order to facilitate and make accessible the enormous sort of swaths of Indian history that one has to look at when one investigates the question of Indian nationalism. And certainly Kassir's sort of theory and idea and belief that myth has an internal logic and his belief in the immediacy of myth, these are ideas sort of exhibited by other philosophers like Dumézil and Malinowski. So Kassir is certainly not important or necessary for understanding Indian nationalism beyond sort of the academic context in which I used him. I think more importantly, the most important question, I think, when one looks at this question of Indian sort of national identities and myth is sort of how does this sort of subjective meaning in myth become sort of objective facticity? How does it make the transition from sort of subjective meaning into this sort of construction of reality in which the country places its faith? And this can be done without the scaffolding of any sort of European philosopher.
So Malinowski, I would not call a philosopher. I would call him very much the founder of structural functions anthropology. And there is a relationship there between him and Gellner. Gellner is a structural functionist when it comes to the question of nationalism. Modern modernity requires a high culture, he thinks. Anything will do to create that high culture, but it needs to be built. And once it's built, it's then pretty stable. The truth that nationalists speak is entirely questionable for Gellner. He thinks they can draw upon anything. Truth and falsity doesn't matter. In that respect, it's a bit like myth. But he would argue that, I think if he were alive today, he would argue that the Cassirere is redundant, and the actual content of the myths is probably also redundant, because they can be reshaped for present usages. I wasn't saying that your account of Cassirere was wrong. I was saying, however, that I found it obscure. I found him obscure.
He
so
is
how
obscure.
you achieve clarity to the general reader in using Cassirere is a genuine problem in my view.
Thank you. That's good to take into account. Thank you.
Unfortunately,
It's lunchtime?
yeah, we have to end, but so not to end it abruptly. I was actually looking at your conversation, and I thought that it was a perfect dialogue with humanists and a political scientist.
These are not incompatible.
No, they're not. But it's a kind of maybe you were lost in a Socratic discussion of what's more important or what's the angle that should be used to approach the question. And I think that as a humanist, I would say, yeah, of course, Kassir is absolutely necessary because you want to understand how human mind works, and unless you do that, you can't understand how political society works, right? So construction of reality. But at the same time, as a political scientist, I understand that you are committed to asking different questions and questions that sometimes humanists do not ask. So I think that that's why it was a very interesting discussion, and it definitely taught the panelists to think about the basis that they haven't covered to be able to talk to social scientists.
Thank you. I would say that to understand the human mind, we shouldn't ignore the humanities or the social sciences, but we should expect most knowledge to come from cognitive science, not from ourselves, either social science or humanity.